Okay, welcome back to lesson 13.5 on voltaic cells. Our objectives for this lesson, we're going to label the parts of a voltaic cell, determine the flow of electrons in this cell, and determine which electrode increases and which one decreases in mass. So our problem, what is electricity and how is it formed? This is our problem from the beginning of the unit. And we learned about oxidation states and half reactions, all to solve this problem, what is electricity and how is it formed? So in a spontaneous redox reaction, electrons are transferred and energy is released. This energy can be used to do work in a voltaic cell, which we call electricity. So a voltaic cell is essentially a battery. It's generating volts. It's a spontaneous redox reaction. We talked about spontaneous reactions using table J in lesson 3. And it spontaneously takes or converts chemical energy from the cell into electrical energy that we can measure in volts, which we call electricity. And the flow of electrons produce that electricity. So how does the cell work? Well, electrons, as I said earlier, spontaneously flow from one end to another. We call that the anode, the more active metal, higher up on table J, to the cathode, the less active metal. The anode is the negative electrode. This is where oxidation occurs, the loss of electrons. That's why electrons are leaving here and going here to the cathode. That's the positive electrode where reduction is taking place, that gain of electrons. So in this case here, the electrons are leaving zinc. Zinc is oxidizing, and they're going through the wire and they are reducing on the copper. Copper is gaining. And a little trick to remember this, anox, red cat. So anox, anode, is the site of oxidation, and your cat here is the reduction, red cat. So reduction is the site, is the cathode. So here's an example. Looking at the zinc and copper from the previous cell, how do I know that it's spontaneous, and how do I know that zinc is going to lose or oxidize and copper is going to gain? I use table J. So when you're given a cell, I look up on table J, I look up zinc, I look up copper. I have zinc right here, and I have copper down here. So the higher up is going to be more spontaneous, and so therefore the zinc is going to oxidize. So electrons are going to be lost from zinc. If it's losing, that means they're going in this direction. That means copper is gaining. So if this is losing, it's oxidation, anox, this is my anode. And then if this is gaining, this is reduction, red cat, this is my cathode. And it kind of makes sense. The cathode is positive, so that means electrons which are negative want to flow to the positive end because opposites attract. Let's check your understanding. Can you determine which is the anode and which is the cathode? And can you determine the flow of electrons? Okay, let's look at all the parts of the voltaic cell, and you have to label these parts. We have the two half cells, which is one beaker here and the other. In the half cells, those are where the half reactions occur. In one side we have oxidation. In this case it happens to be on the left hand side for the same example. And then the other side is going to be the half reaction, which is reduction. We have electrodes, the metals here. These are the sites of oxidation and reduction. We have the wire for electrons to flow. And we have this thing here called, this tube, the salt bridge. Allows ions to flow, and it prevents the buildup of charge. It's going to maintain electrical neutrality, and we'll talk about that later. And lastly, we have a voltmeter, which measures the electric current in volts. So how do we label this voltaic cell? Well, first we're going to determine which electrode is the anode, which is the cathode. Identify where oxidation and reduction takes place using our red cat anox, and determine the electron flow. As you mentioned earlier, we're going to use table J to do this. So the more active metal, higher up, as we said, is oxidized or more easily oxidized. So remember this, electrons will flow from high to low. So electrons flow from the higher up metal to the lower down metal. So for example, in this cell, zinc and copper, electrons flow from high to low. So from zinc to copper. Once we know it's going from zinc to copper, now we really can start to label everything. Because if we're losing electrons, a loss of electrons is oxidation, that's our Leo, and a gain of electrons is reduction, that's our Ger. Now if we remember anox, red cat, If this is losing electrons, oxidation, that must be the anode. And if this is gaining electrons, that's reduction, that must be the cathode. Alright, let's check our understanding. Can you determine which is the anode and which is the cathode? And can you determine that flow of electrons? Okay, what happens to the electrodes as electrons flow? Well, in this case, if this is zinc is losing electrons, so my solid zinc is then turning into, it's losing 2 electrons, it's turning to zinc ions. So the zinc ions in solution are going to increase and the electrode is going to decrease in size and mass. And if electrons are flowing through the copper wire, they flow down through the electrode and they're going to give themselves to the copper. So the copper ion is going to turn into solid copper and we're going to get more copper depositing. So the metal is going to increase. So the cathode is going to increase in mass and the anode is going to decrease. So as zinc starts to lose electrons, they flow through the wire. When it loses electrons, it turns into the ions, as I said, and flows through the wire, giving it to the copper plus 2, which is going to deposit on the copper. If you look at the half reactions, we can see that. So as solid zinc, which is our electrode, loses electrons, these 2 electrons, it turns into Zn plus 2 ions, aqueous, in solution. So the ions in solution go up. And on the opposite end, when we gain the electrons, the Cu plus 2, which is in solution here, it's going to turn into copper solid, which is going to deposit on the electrode, and this will get bigger. So the way I remember that is the red cat gets fat. So this is the cathode, the site of reduction, and therefore it's going to get fat, get bigger in mass. Let's check your understanding. Can you determine which electrode increases and which one decreases in mass? Okay, lastly, the function of the salt bridge. As I mentioned, the salt bridge allows for the flow of ions to prevent a buildup of charge at each electrode. Positive ions flow to the cathode, and the negative ions flow down to the anode, basically opposite of the electron charge. We have negative electrons going this way, and therefore positives are going to go through and balance that out, and vice versa. If we're losing negative charge on this end, we're putting negative charge back, balancing out that flow of electrons. Why? Well, if we start to lose electrons, this side becomes very positive very quickly, and if we're putting electrons on this side, which is normally positive, it's going to gain negative charge and become very negative very quickly. That's a problem because if electrons are trying to flow and they're negative, they are going to be repelled back and actually pulled towards the anode, and the flow of electrons stops, and therefore electricity stops. So if we remove the salt bridge, the voltmeter will read 0 and we lose the flow of electrons. Okay, so here's an example, and this is cut from a Regents exam, and they're asking you to label the following: anode, cathode, where oxidation and reduction take place, and the direction of electron flow. So here's the steps that you want to do. First thing you do is you locate your metals. We have silver and we have nickel. I locate those on table J. I see silver on the bottom here, and I see nickel is up top. Electrons flow from high to low, so they're flowing from nickel to silver. So I locate that on my example here. So electrons are flowing from nickel to silver. So now that I know nickel's losing electrons, Leo tells me a loss of electrons is oxidation. So this is my oxidation site. And then if the left side, the silver, is gaining electrons, Ger tells me that this is the site of reduction. Then I use my anox red cat. So the anode is the site of oxidation. So this is my anode, and therefore this is my cathode. And you see that we essentially labeled everything they're asking. Now we could take a step further. Let's say they ask what is the charge of each electrode. Is it positive or negative? Well, use your common sense. If electrons are negative, that means they've got to be going to a positive terminal or positive electrode. So the cathode is going to be positive, and then the anode must be negative. That's where the negative charges are coming from. And lastly, if they asked about the mass, which electrode is increasing mass and which one is decreasing mass, remember the red cat gets fat. So the cathode is going to increase in mass, and the anode is going to decrease in mass. Okay, let's try one more. So again, we're labeling the same thing. So first I want to do is locate my metals on table J. I see copper is down here, and I see magnesium is higher up, so electrons flow from high to low. So magnesium to copper. So I label my electrons. If magnesium is losing electrons, Leo tells me this is my oxidation, and then Ger tells me this is my reduction. Anox, red cat, so anode, cathode. And again, if we want to label the signs, electrons are flowing to the positive end and coming from the negative end. And red cat gets fat. This electrode is going to increase in mass, and the magnesium will decrease in mass. All right, check your understanding. Can you determine which is the anode, which is the cathode? Determine the electron flow, and can you determine which electrode increases and decreases in mass? At this point, you must be able to determine which is the anode and which is the cathode, determine the flow of electrons, and determine which electrode increases and which decreases in mass.